There are towns in the American West where a man's reputation travels faster than he does. Not the reputation he builds deliberately, not the one he announces at the saloon or stitches together from land deeds and cattle counts, but the quieter kind, the kind that accumulates the way sediment does, layer by layer, without anyone deciding to put it there. Crestfall, Wyoming sat at the foot of the Laramie Range in the summer of 1883, a town of 200 souls and one main street wide enough for two wagons to pass without incident. And in Crestfall, that kind of reputation belonged to Eli Callum. He was 30 years old. He ran the livery stable on the south end of Main Street, a business he had inherited from his uncle at 23, with two horses, a leaking roof, and a ledger that hadn't balanced in 4 years. 7 years later, the roof held the ledger balanced to the penny, and the stable kept 12 horses on any given week. None of that had happened by accident. It had happened the way most things worth having happen, slowly, stubbornly, through the accumulation of mornings that began before the sun cleared the mountains. He was up before 5, not because someone told him to be, not because the work demanded it exactly though it did. He was up because the hour before Crestfall woke was the hour he understood best, the light low and gray, the mountains to the west, still dark against the sky, just beginning to consider changing its mind about the night. He moved through the stable with the unhurried certainty of a man who has done the same thing so many times that the doing no longer requires thought, only presence. Water, feed, the slow audit of each animal's condition, a hoof held up and examined, a coat checked with the flat of a palm, the particular attention given to old Henderson's bay mare, who had a tendency to favor her left foreleg in cold weather, even when the weather wasn't yet cold. The horses knew him. That was not a small thing in Eli's accounting of the world. Animals knew a man before people did, and what they knew was harder to fake. The Henderson mare, who had bitten the last farrier badly enough to leave a scar, stood without shifting when Eli worked her feet. The Callaway gelding, 17 hands and temperamental about it, dropped his head when Eli put a hand on his neck. Eli had never explained this to anyone. It wasn't the kind of thing that required explanation. It was simply the result of 7 years of showing up and being the same every time. Calhoun had a theory about this. Calhoun, whose given name was Robert, but who had answered to his surname since boyhood on account of 3 other Roberts in his school class, and a school teacher who had solved the problem with a practicality that stuck, ran the smithy 2 lots north of the livery, and he had known Eli Callum longer than almost anyone in Crestfall. His theory, stated plainly one evening over a shared bottle of decent whiskey, was that Eli had a quality that most men either never developed or deliberately shed somewhere in early adulthood. He was the same whether anyone was watching or not. No performance, no adjustment for audience. The same man at 5 in the morning in an empty stable as he was at noon on Main Street with half the town in earshot. Calhoun considered this admirable. He also considered it, in certain specific circumstances, a significant liability. The specific circumstance he had in mind had a name. The name was Nora Whitmore. She was 26 years old, the eldest daughter of Arthur Whitmore, who owned the general store at the north end of Main Street, the only general store in Crestfall, which gave Arthur Whitmore a particular kind of quiet authority in a town where dry goods were not a luxury. Nora had grown up behind that counter, which meant she had grown up knowing the name of every family in Crestfall County, what they ordered when they were short on money and too proud to say so, and how to manage the delicate business of extending credit in a way that preserved everyone's dignity. She was warm in the way of someone who has never had to manufacture warmth. It was simply the first register she operated in the default setting before any other consideration entered. She kept her hair pinned during the day. Her eyes were the particular color that couldn't settle on a decision green in morning light, gray by afternoon. Something in between when the clouds came down over the mountains and the whole valley went silver. She was funny in the dry, understated way of people raised in commerce, where the measure of a joke is whether it lands without anyone bleeding. She was capable in ways that the women of frontier towns were capable, not because capability was a virtue she had cultivated, but because the alternative had never been available to her. Every man of appropriate age in Crestfall County had at some point in the past 6 years considered the question of Nora Whitmore. Most of them had done considerably more than consider. There had been formal courtships, flowers left on the counter, invitations to dances, 2 separate Sunday suppers that Margaret Whitmore had managed with the diplomatic neutrality of someone refereeing a contest she had no interest in influencing. A cattle rancher from the Ridgeline operation 40 miles north had reportedly made Arthur Whitmore an offer of such specificity that Arthur had set down his coffee mug very carefully before responding. The response had been his daughter made her own decisions. Nora had declined all of them. Not coldly, there was no coldness in it, which was part of what made the declining so difficult to be appropriately angry about. She was warm in rejection, the way she was warm in everything else, which left men walking away confused about whether they had been turned down or thanked. She sent them off with their dignity more or less intact, and that was more than most of them had arrived with. People had theories. She was too particular. She was waiting for someone from back east, a professional man, a lawyer, or a doctor. She had made some private decision after the Harmon girls' difficult marriage. None of the theories were right, but they were believed with the conviction that fills in when the truth isn't available for examination. The truth was considerably simpler. The truth had a name. The truth was Eli Callum, and he came in every Wednesday morning for nails and rope and sometimes lamp oil, and he said, "Morning, Nora," the way a man says good morning to the mountains outside his window, aware they're there, aware they're worth something, somehow never quite registering that the distance between himself and them is a distance he could choose to cross. On the first Wednesday of June, 1883, Eli came in for a pound of nails and 20 feet of half-inch rope. Nora was on the step stool behind the counter reorganizing the dry goods shelf with the concentration of a woman who has decided that this particular arrangement of flour sacks and coffee tins is a problem requiring her full attention. She heard the door, heard the particular rhythm of his boots on the floorboards. She knew his walk the way she knew the bell above the door without deciding to know it. "Morning, Nora." She handed down a tin of coffee to the lower shelf without turning. "Morning, Eli." The words were the same words they had always been. The distance between them was the same distance it had always been. He went to the nail bin, measured his rope, brought both to the counter. She stepped down from the stool, tallied the total, took his money, counted back the change. Their hands did not touch. They rarely did. He thanked her, she told him to have a good morning, and he went out the door. Calhoun was on the boardwalk outside, leaning against the post with the particular patience of a man who has nowhere urgent to be. He watched Eli come out with his nails, and Rope watched him settle his hat, watched him start back down the street toward the livery. Calhoun looked at the sky. Calhoun looked at the door Eli had just come through. Calhoun shook his head with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who has been watching the same thing for a long time without the situation improving. "You know something," Calhoun said to Eli's back. "For a man who works with horses all day, you have a remarkable inability to see what's standing right in front of you." Eli stopped, turned, looked at Calhoun with genuine, uncomplicated puzzlement. "What are you talking about?" Calhoun looked at the sky again. "Nothing," he said. "Absolutely nothing." He pushed off the post and went back toward the smithy, and if there was something in his expression that wasn't quite nothing, Eli didn't catch it. He stood on the boardwalk for another moment with his nails and his rope, and then he went back to work because work was what the morning required, and Eli Callum had never been a man to stand around when there was something that needed doing. That was the Wednesday. The knowing, the real knowing, the kind that rearranges the furniture of a man's interior without asking permission came that night. He sat on the front step of the livery after the last horse was settled the way he sometimes did in summer when the heat of the day had finally agreed to lift and the mountains turned purple in the last light. He was not thinking about Nora Whitmore. He was thinking about a joint on the Henderson mare's left foreleg that he wanted to wrap before morning, and whether the supply of decent liniment was going to hold through the month, and whether the Callaway gelding was eating enough. These were the thoughts that generally occupied the hours between the end of work and the beginning of sleep. And they were sufficient thoughts, useful thoughts, the kind of thoughts a man could build a good, honest life around. Then something shifted, not dramatically, not the way a man describes it afterward when he's trying to make it sound like a moment of revelation worth reporting. It shifted the way a log settles in a fire without announcement, just a small collapse that changes the shape of everything above it. He was thinking about the Wednesday routine, the nails and rope, the way the morning light came through the front windows of the Whitmore store, and hit the counter at that particular angle in June, the flour dust in the air catching it. The way Nora had handed down the coffee tin without turning around, the ease of someone at home in her own work. The way she had said "Morning, Eli" in the same tone she had said it 1,000 times before. He was aware, sitting on that step in the last of the summer light, that Nora Whitmore was the most remarkable person in Crestfall. He had always been aware of this. It had been a fact of his world, as settled as the mountains, as unremarkable in its dailiness, because remarkable and unremarkable were not opposites he understood now sitting there. A thing could be extraordinary every day, and the dailiness of it was what made you stop seeing the extraordinary part. You saw the fact. You stopped seeing the weight of it. He knew she was warm. He knew she was sharp in the particular way that people who grow up behind a counter are sharp. She could read a room the way he could read a horse through the small signals that most people transmitted without meaning to. He knew she was funny in that dry way that only landed if you were paying attention, which meant it was always funnier to the people who deserved to find it funny. He knew she had turned down every man in the county for 6 years running, which he had always filed under her being particular, which seemed like a reasonable thing for a person of her quality to be. He sat there on the step. The light went. The mountains went black. The first stars appeared over the eastern ridge the way they always did at that hour, unhurried about it. He was a man who ran a livery stable. He had calloused palms and a leaking roof that he'd patched 3 times because replacing it properly required money he kept putting toward other things. He had no land beyond the lot the stable sat on. He had a decent reputation which he had never thought of as a thing that might count for something in a particular kind of accounting. Nobody had told him he wasn't enough. That was the thing that arrived last, the thing that sat down beside him on that step, uninvited. Nobody had told him. He had told himself somewhere back in the years before he noticed he was doing it in the quiet way a man assembles his understanding of his own place in the world. Practical, unsentimental, calibrated to the evidence as he'd read it. He was a good man with a modest operation who had never thought to extend the category of things available to him past what the evidence seemed to support. He got up, went inside, did not sleep well. He did not examine the feeling further that week. This was consistent with his character. Eli Callum was not a man who prodded at things. He was a man who waited until the shape of a problem became clear enough to work with, and this particular problem had not yet revealed its full shape. He went to work. He came in on Friday for lamp oil. He said, "Morning, Nora." She said, "Morning, Eli." He went back to the livery. Calhoun watched this from the smithy doorway. Calhoun said nothing. The man who changed the shape of things arrived on the 14th of June, a Tuesday, which nobody considered significant at the time. Franklin Holt was 42 years old. He had built the largest cattle operation in Crestfall County from 40 acres of poor rangeland and a stubbornness that men who admired him called vision and men who didn't like him called something less charitable. The Holt operation now ran nearly 3,000 head across leased federal range, employed 11 men full-time, and produced the kind of quiet financial authority that in a frontier county meant something more concrete than money. It meant stability. It meant permanence. It meant the kind of man that a bank in Laramie sent a letter to rather than waiting for him to come to them. He was not a large man physically. Medium height, medium build, with the broad shoulders of someone who had done real work before the work became supervisory. He had a face that had weathered into its lines early, the deep crease at the corners of his eyes, from years of squinting into Wyoming sun, and a way of moving through a room that was neither hurried nor slow, but simply deliberate, the walk of a man who had decided where he was going and saw no reason to announce it. He came into the Whitmore store on that Tuesday afternoon and did not buy what he came in for. What he came in for was not on the shelves. He bought a coil of rope he did not need, paid without haggling, and left. Arthur Whitmore watched from behind the counter with the expression of a man reading a letter and not liking the news, though no letter had been exchanged, no conversation of consequence had occurred. He watched Holt's back go through the door. He watched the door close. Nora was in the back storeroom tallying a supply order. She came through at the sound of the door. Who was that, Mum? Franklin Holt. Arthur picked up the payment Holt had left, looked at it, set it in the till. Buying rope he doesn't need. Nora looked at the door. Then she looked at her father. Arthur had gone back to the counter with the expression of a man examining something on the shelf behind him that didn't require examination. She went back to the storeroom. She finished the supply order. She did not think about Franklin Holt in any particular way because she had no particular reason to, not yet, because the thing that would give her a reason had not yet fully assembled itself. The town noticed before she did. Crestfall was the size of town where noticing was both occupation and obligation. By the following Wednesday, 3 separate conversations at the Whitmore counter had included some version of Franklin Holt's name, each delivered with the careful casualness of someone who has prepared their casual very carefully. By Friday, old Pete Marsh, who came in every Friday for tobacco, and who had been coming in every Friday for tobacco since before Nora could reach the counter, said without preamble as he counted out his coins, "Holt was asking about your family at the feed store Tuesday. Not buying anything, just asking." Nora counted the coins back. "People ask." Pete took his tobacco. "Not the way Holt asks." On a Saturday morning, Calhoun appeared at the livery while Eli was reshoeing the Callaway gelding. This was not unusual. Calhoun appeared at the livery regularly, sometimes with a reason and sometimes without one, and the distinction between the two had never been made explicit. He leaned against the stall door. He watched Eli work for a while. "Then Holt's been asking about Nora Whitmore." Eli set the hoof down, straightened. "Where'd you hear that?" Pete Marsh, who heard it from Daniel Reeves' wife, who heard it from Holt's foreman, who has no cause to make things up. Calhoun crossed his arms. "He's not asking social questions. He's asking the kind of questions a man asks before he makes up his mind." Eli considered this. He picked up the next shoe, held it against the gelding's hoof to check the fit. "That's between Holt and Whitmore," he said. Calhoun was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. "Is it?" he said. "Not a question. What else would it be?" Calhoun looked at him with the expression of a man who has decided that a certain conversation needs to happen, but is still calculating the correct angle of approach. He did not say anything further. He pushed off the stall door. He went back to the smithy. Eli finished the gelding's shoes. He did the Henderson mare's liniment wrap. He swept the stable floor, which did not need sweeping, and then swept it again, which it also did not need. The thing that Calhoun had said, the thing that wasn't a question, sat in the back of the stable with him all afternoon, not demanding attention, just present. That was the Saturday. The Midsummer Dance was held the third Friday of July in the barn behind Keener's feed store, which was the largest covered space in Crestfall that wasn't a church. Margaret Whitmore spent 3 days on Nora's dress, a pale cream with a lace collar that she had ordered the fabric for in the spring, for no stated occasion, with the particular foresight of a woman who understood that occasions required preparation rather than the other way around. Arthur had already told half the county his daughter would be there. So Nora went with the specific composure of a woman who has learned to be graceful about situations she did not entirely choose. Eli arrived late. This was not unusual. The animals did not know it was a dance night, and the Henderson mare had been off her feed since midday, in a way Eli didn't like well enough to leave without checking twice. He came through the barn doors at 8:30, still carrying the faint residue of the stable on him. Not unclean exactly, just unmistakably himself. The smell of hay and leather and honest work that no amount of preparation fully erased. He accepted a cup from the refreshment table, found a position against the far wall, with a sight line to most of the room, and settled in with the ease of a man who is genuinely comfortable watching other people enjoy themselves. He saw Nora almost immediately. She was on the floor with Calhoun's cousin, a perfectly decent man named Warren, who ranched a small spread southeast of town and danced with the careful attention of someone counting beats. She wore the cream dress, her hair properly done, and she moved through the dance with the warm, engaged attention she gave everything present without performing, interested without straining. She was the kind of person who made whoever she was dancing with feel like the best dancer in the room, even when they demonstrably were not. Franklin Holt arrived at 9. The shift in the room when he entered was not dramatic, but it was perceptible, a slight adjustment in the social geometry, the way people position themselves relative to the fact of him. He was the kind of man whose presence rearranged a room's understanding of where the center of gravity was. He moved through greetings with the efficient courtesy of someone who has performed public interaction many times and made it functional without making it warm. He asked Nora to dance. She accepted because not accepting would have required a reason that a public occasion did not permit, and Nora Whitmore did not manufacture scenes. Holt was a good dancer. This surprised nobody. A man did not build what Holt had built without learning to operate smoothly in every environment that mattered. He was attentive. He was correct. He guided with the confident precision of someone who had learned dancing the way he learned everything else, as a skill with a purpose practiced until it was reliable. He was not unkind. He talked with appropriate courtesy. But his eyes, when Nora caught them, held that quality she had noticed in the store, the careful evaluating attention of a man in the process of making a decision. Not cold, not cruel, simply deliberate in a way that had nothing to do with the music. Across the barn, Eli watched this from his position against the wall. He watched the way Holt held himself, the way his attention sat on Nora with that particular focused quality. He felt something move in his chest, not dramatic, not the kind of thing a man named aloud at a dance, just a pressure low and persistent, like weather coming in off the mountains before the clouds are visible. He turned it over, once looked at it, put it back where he found it. Then the song ended. Nora, turning from Holt's arm back toward the room, found Eli's eyes across the width of the barn. The distance between them was 40 feet and every person at the Crestfall Midsummer Dance. She smiled, not the composed, warm public smile she had been deploying all evening, not the version available to the room. The other one. Quick Private arrived and gone before it could be cataloged by anyone watching, meant specifically and without ambiguity for him alone. Eli's chest shifted. Something that had been sitting in a particular position for a long time moved slightly the way a stone moves in a riverbed when the current changes. He smiled back, simple, unrehearsed, the smile of a man responding to something he recognized without fully knowing what he was recognizing. Then Tom Fletcher appeared at his elbow with a question about a horse trade that needed answering before Monday, and Eli turned because Fletcher's question was real and present, and Eli was a man who dealt with the real and present, and the thing that had just passed across 40 feet of dance floor did not have a name yet, not one he was ready to use. Later that night, back at the livery, after the last check of the horses and the extinguishing of the lamp, Eli sat on the step again. The mountains were invisible in the darkness. The stars were dense over the valley. The sounds of the dance had ended an hour ago. The wagons gone back out the roads that led away from Crestfall toward the ranches and homesteads that made up the rest of the county. He sat there and he thought about Holt. He thought about the way Holt had looked at Nora, not with the hopeful, slightly uncertain attention of the men who had been asking her to dances for 6 years, but with something more settled, more decided. The attention of a man who had already moved past the question of whether and was now working on the question of how. He thought about what Calhoun had said, the questions Holt had been asking, the kind a man asks before he makes up his mind. He thought about the smile across the barn, the other one, the quick one, the one not available to the room. He had received that smile before. Not often, but he had received it. He had always received it and filed it under. That is what it looks like when Nora Whitmore is genuinely glad to see you. He had never considered that the category of people who received that smile might be a category of one. He thought about the feeling in his chest when Holt held her arm at the end of the song. He thought about Calhoun's "is it?" Not a question. He thought about 6 years of declined courtships, which he had always read as particularity, as a woman of quality, setting appropriate standards, as a thing entirely separate from him. He thought about what it would mean if it wasn't. He sat with that for a long time. The night moved around him, the summer insects loud in the grass, the horses quiet behind him. At some point before midnight, he went inside. He lay in the dark with the ceiling above him and the mountains invisible outside, and the slow settling weight of a thing he had been not seeing for a very long time finally making itself impossible to misread. He was in love with Nora Whitmore. He didn't know when it had started. He suspected it had started long enough ago that the starting point was no longer visible the way a river's source is sometimes so far back in the mountains that you can't walk to it in a day. He had simply been in it the way you're in weather without having decided to step outside. The second thing arrived right behind the first, familiar and efficient. He was a man who ran a livery stable with calloused hands and a patched roof. He had always been clear about what that meant. He had always been clear about the category of things available to him. Nobody had told him this. That was the fact that kept returning each time, slightly different, slightly sharper. Nobody had told him. The distance he had always understood to exist between himself and what Nora Whitmore represented was a distance he had measured himself with his own instruments, calibrated to a certainty nobody had asked him to produce. He had simply produced it, quietly over years without announcing it, without anyone countersigning the finding. He turned that over in the dark for a long time. He did not sleep until nearly 2. The following Monday, Calhoun came to the livery in the early morning with the directness of a man who has decided the time for oblique commentary has passed. He did not lean against the stall door this time. He stood in the middle of the stable floor, hands in his pockets, while Eli worked the Callaway gelding's coat with a brush in the long strokes the horse preferred. Holt's going to make a formal offer. Calhoun said it the way he said things that were facts rather than speculation, no lead-in, no cushioning. Within the month, I heard it from 2 separate people who have no reason to coordinate. Eli kept brushing. The gelding's ear twitched. Who told you? Daniel Reeve, and Margaret Whitmore's sister, who was visiting from Cheyenne and heard something she probably wasn't supposed to. Calhoun watched him. Eli, do you understand what I'm telling you? Eli set the brush down on the stall rail. He turned and looked at Calhoun with the steady, uncomplicated attention he gave everything. I understand what you're telling me. Do you understand what it means? A moment of silence. A horse shifted in the far stall. Outside, the morning was beginning its business, the sound of a wagon on the street, the distant clang of the first work from somewhere north. Eli looked at his hands, the same hands they had always been worn from years of honest work. I'm working on it, he said. Calhoun studied him for a long moment. Then Eli, you are the best man I know. I mean that without qualification. He paused. I also think you have spent a significant number of years telling yourself a story about what you're worth that nobody else has ever agreed to. He let that sit. Nobody told you that story. I want you to be clear on that. You wrote it yourself. Eli said nothing. The gelding nudged his shoulder, wanting the brush back. Within the month, Calhoun said again and left. Eli stood in the stable for a long time after the sound of Calhoun's boots faded on the street. The gelding waited patiently. Outside, Crestfall continued its morning, ordinary, unhurried, indifferent to the particular rearrangement happening inside one man in one stable on the south end of Main Street. He picked up the brush. He finished the gelding's coat. He did the water. He did the feed. He looked once toward the north end of the street, where the Whitmore store's front windows caught the morning sun. The distance between here and there was the length of Main Street. He had walked it 1,000 times. He had never once walked it with the thought that he could be walking towards something rather than simply through it. He went back to work. But the story he had been telling himself for years, the one nobody had asked him to tell, the one he had written alone in the quiet accumulation of modest self-accounting, that story had a crack in it, now small but definite, the kind that starts at the edge and works inward, and nothing he did for the rest of that morning made it any smaller. The thing about a clock is that you don't hear it until the room goes quiet. Eli Callum had lived with the quiet hum of his own life for 30 years. The stable, the horses, the ledger that balanced the mornings that began before the town woke, and none of it had ever felt like waiting, because waiting requires knowing what you're waiting for. He had not known. He had simply been living, which is what a man does when he has work that matters and enough decency to do it well. And the difference between living and waiting is something you can only measure in retrospect when the room finally goes quiet enough to hear the clock. The room went quiet on that Monday morning in the stable after Calhoun left. He worked through the rest of it with the systematic attention he gave all things that required his hands, the afternoon shoes, the evening feed, the long last check before dark. His hands knew the work well enough to do it without consultation, which left the part of him that was not his hands to sit with what Calhoun had said. Within the month. The kind of questions a man asks before he makes up his mind. Eli had been making up his own mind about what he was worth for long enough that the conclusion felt like fact rather than opinion, and the specific unsettling quality of what Calhoun had laid out that morning was the suggestion that a conclusion reached without outside review was not the same thing as a conclusion that was true. He didn't sleep well that night either. This was becoming a pattern. Tuesday passed. Wednesday he went to the Whitmore store for nothing. He actually needed a single box of tacks that he had to invent a purpose for on the walk up the street. Nora was behind the counter tallying a delivery manifest, her pen moving down columns of figures with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that the numbers spoke directly to her without requiring translation. She heard the bell. She looked up. Morning, Eli. Her eyes went back to the manifest. Not dismissive, she was finishing a count the way he would finish checking a hoof before acknowledging someone who walked into the stable. Present to the work until the work permitted the shift. He put the box of tacks on the counter. She finished the column, set her pen down, tallied the tacks, took his money. The transaction was identical to 100 previous transactions. He said thank you. She said have a good morning. He went out. On the boardwalk, he stood for a moment with the box of tacks he did not need. Down the street, Calhoun's smithy was already producing its morning noise, the specific rhythmic impact of hammer on metal that had served as a kind of ambient clock for Crestfall since before either of them had been old enough to notice it. Eli looked at the tacks. He went back to the stable. The 3 days after the Monday conversation were not dramatic. That was the honest account of them. No revelation, no sudden clarity, just the persistent low-grade alteration of a man whose most settled understanding of himself had been challenged by someone who knew him well enough to challenge it with accuracy. He went about his work. He was, if anything, more thorough than usual. The Henderson mare's leg got wrapped with unusual care. The Callaway gelding's feed was adjusted with the kind of attention that the gelding, being a horse, did not appreciate, but got anyway. The work was the thing Eli had always been able to trust, and he trusted it now, even as the thing underneath it refused to go back to the shape it had held for years. On Thursday afternoon, Arthur Whitmore walked into the livery. This was not a thing that happened with any regularity. Arthur was a man whose geography centered on his store, his home 3 streets north, in the church on Sunday mornings, not from incuriosity, but from the particular self-containment of a man whose world had been clearly arranged for long enough that departing from it required intention rather than accident. He came through the stable doors in the middle of the afternoon with the deliberate step of a man who has decided to do a thing before the decision changes its mind. Eli was cleaning tack at the workbench, the leather bridles hung over the rail in a row, the oiling cloth in his hand. He looked up. Arthur came in far enough to be clearly inside, stopped, looked around with the mild interest of a man in an unfamiliar room. He had the expression that men wear when they are about to do something indirect. "I need a good driving rein," Arthur said. "Double-stitched if you have it. Margaret's been after me about the old set." He moved to the wall where Eli kept the finished tack for sale and stood examining things with slightly more attention than a man buying driving reins typically brought to the selection. Eli set down the oiling cloth. He went to the proper section of the wall, pulled down a good set of driving reins, double-stitched, oiled sound. He put them on the bench. Arthur looked at them. He ran a thumb along the stitching. Then he stood with the reins in his hands and said in the tone of a man reading aloud something he has been composing in his head since leaving his front door. "Eli, I have run a store for 22 years. You get a feel for inventory." He was looking at the driving reins. "You get a feel for when something is about to move, when there's interest from a serious buyer." He set the reins down. He counted out the price without being told it. "A man in my position thinks about these things. That's all." He picked up the reins. He went back through the stable doors. He did not look back. Eli stood at the workbench in the specific stillness of a man who has just been handed a message that arrived in code but translated cleanly. Arthur Whitmore had not come to the livery for driving reins. Margaret Whitmore managed fine with whatever tack they had. What Arthur Whitmore had come to the livery to deliver was the particular communication of a man who could not say plainly what he needed to say to a man not yet entitled to hear it plainly, but who had come anyway because the alternative was saying nothing, and saying nothing was no longer something Arthur was willing to do. "A man in my position thinks about these things." Eli picked up the oiling cloth, set it down again, looked at the wall where the driving reins had hung, the empty hook now bare. He thought about Nora behind the counter with the manifest, the pen moving down columns, the unself-conscious competence of a woman entirely at home in her own ability. He thought about the smile across the barn, the quick one, the private one, the one he had received and filed without understanding what file it belonged in. He thought about Calhoun's "You wrote that story yourself. Nobody asked you to." He was a man who had always been careful about moving too fast with things he couldn't afford to break. This caution was not cowardice. In every other domain of his life, it was sound practice. You didn't rush a horse that wasn't ready. You didn't push a joint that was healing. You didn't expand the business past what the money could support. This same caution applied to himself in the matter of what he deserved had kept him standing in place for years, while the thing he was being careful about stood at the north end of Main Street, saying morning to him twice a week. The distinction arrived clean and hard. There was caution that protected something, and there was caution that simply cost you. And he had been calling the second kind by the first kind's name for long enough to have built a habit out of it. He went back to the tack. He finished the afternoon. He did the evening feed. He stood outside in the late light and looked north, within the month. The day that changed the specific geometry of everything was the Friday 2 weeks after the dance. Eli knew the shape of it afterward in the way you know the shape of a day that divided things into before and after. He had been putting off the memory. Not deliberately, not with any conscious decision to avoid it more, the way a man doesn't press on a bruise that he knows is there, the avoidance instinctive rather than chosen. But standing alone in the stable on that Friday morning with the Callaway gelding, eating with the focused contentment of an animal whose only concern is the grain in front of him, the memory came through the way water finds the crack in a foundation without asking. 2 years back. November, the wet kind. Not snow yet, but the cold rain that comes before it in Wyoming. The ground turning to mud, the sky, the color of old iron. He had owed Arthur Whitmore $2 from a back order that had come in late, and he had gone up to the store after closing time because he would be out before dawn the next morning and didn't want the debt to sit another week. He knocked. Nora answered. Her father was in the back. She said, "Come in." She took the money, wrote the receipt. The lamp on the counter made a warm circle in the store's dark interior, the rain coming down outside the windows, in the way Wyoming rain came down when it meant it. They were the only two people in the room. He could count on one hand the number of times in his adult life he had been in a room alone with Nora Whitmore, because her days happened in public behind the counter, in the middle of the town's commerce and solitude. With her was not something the ordinary arrangement of life produced. She counted the change back. She handed it across the counter. He reached for it. She was still holding it, just for the moment. It takes a hand to arrive, and she looked up at him, and something crossed her face that he had registered at the time and immediately misread. She opened her mouth. The words were forming. He could see them in the particular gathering of breath and expression that precedes speech. She was going to say something that was not about the change, not about the receipt, not about the rain or the closing time or the ordinary business of the transaction. He had seen it and not known what he was seeing, the way you see smoke on the horizon and think weather before you think fire. Then he had turned to look at the rain on the windows. Beautiful rain like this. His voice easy, the words of a man filling a comfortable silence with something harmless. "Don't get this kind much." Nora's breath came out. "No," she said, the change still in her hand. "Not much." He took the change. He thanked her. He went home through the wet streets, pulling his collar up, thinking about whether the stable drainage would hold through a rain this sustained. He had not thought about her expression. He had not thought about the words that didn't come. He had registered it with the same attention he gave to most things about Nora Whitmore, present, appreciated, filed under the ordinary pleasant texture of knowing her, nothing more. Standing now in the Friday morning stable with the gelding eating behind him, Eli understood for the first time what he had been standing in front of 2 years ago. The expression, the gathered breath, the words that had assembled and then been put back. She had been about to say something true, the kind of true that doesn't have a practice run, the kind you build up to, and then either say or put away, and when you put it away, you don't always find it again at the same strength. He had been looking at the rain. The gelding finished his grain. The sound of the empty bucket was loud in the quiet stable. Eli set his hand on the rail. He thought about 2 years. He thought about the stack of declined courtships. He thought about Holt's careful eyes at the dance. He thought about Arthur and the driving rains and the message delivered in plain sight. He set the feed bucket on the hook. He walked to the stable door and looked north up the street. The Whitmore store was open. He could see the lamp in the window. The sign on the door turned to the side that meant business hours. 2 years, 1 month. The math of it was not comfortable. A good man who has spent years not asking can spend a few more days not asking and still be a good man. This was the argument he had always been able to make to himself because it was technically true. But technical truth and actual truth are different instruments, and what Calhoun had handed him, what Arthur had handed him, what the memory of a November rain was now adding its weight to, was the actual truth. The cost of not asking was not borne only by him. He went back to work. But something had shifted alignment, the way a bone settles after a long misalignment, uncomfortable in the new position, but closer to right than it had been. The Saturday of the following week, Eli was working outside the stable in the morning sun, a harness spread over the sawhorses, the leather dark with old oil that needed working out before new could go in. It was the kind of work his hands could do while his mind did other business, and his mind had been doing significant other business all week. Nora came down the street. This was not unusual. Her route from the Whitmore house to the store ran past the livery, had run past it her whole life. He heard her before he saw her, the particular rhythm of her walk. He knew the way, he knew Calhoun's hammer. She had a basket supply samples from the Tuesday delivery, he guessed being taken home for some household purpose. She slowed when she saw him, the way she always slowed because they were neighbors, and any morning with him in it was better than a morning without. That was how she had always moved through the world, giving her attention generously without rationing it. She stopped. They talked. The heat, which had been unusual for the last week. The Henderson mare whose leg Nora had been asking after with the interest of someone who had watched Eli treat it across 3 seasons. The late summer rain that everyone wanted and nobody expected. Ordinary conversation, the kind built from years of proximity, comfortable in the way only long familiarity produces. Then Eli set down the harness section he'd been working. He looked at her, the direct, steady look he gave to things he had decided about. The look that meant he had finished the internal argument. His voice came out even without performance, without the self-deprecating softening he might have used a week ago. Nora, I heard about Holt. She went still. Not alarmed, a stillness that meant she was paying full attention, the way a person goes quiet when the thing they have been listening for finally arrives. I have no right to say anything about it. Each word deliberate, chosen. I know that. I've had no right for a long time because I didn't say what I should have said when I should have said it. His eyes held hers without flinching from it. But I need to tell you something before you make any decisions. I should have told you a long time ago. I convinced myself it wasn't possible, wasn't something a man in my position ought to say, and I was wrong about that. Wrong in a way I don't intend to keep being. The street was warm, a door opened somewhere down the block. None of it interrupted the specific silence between them. I love you. The words arrived without hedging, without the armor of irony or hypothetical. I think I have for years without having the sense to understand what I was looking at. I know that might not change anything, but I couldn't let Holt. I couldn't let you think nobody saw you. A beat. I see you. I was just slow to know what seeing you meant. Nora looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the sounds of the street continued around them. A horse somewhere, the distant voice of someone calling across a fence, and none of it touched the silence between them. Then she stepped one step closer, the kind of step that costs something to take, the kind that cannot be called back once it's made. Her voice was low enough for only him, the tone of a woman who has waited for a specific thing long enough that when it arrives she meets it without theater. Eli, I have been keeping my heart for you for years. I only needed you to show up. She held his gaze long enough for the weight of it to land fully. Then quieter still, with the particular steadiness of someone who has said the true thing and is not going to unsay it. Don't make me wait anymore. He didn't answer with the words. He didn't have the right words yet, not for what that sentence was worth. He stood with it, the weight of it, the clarity of it, the specific mercy of being seen by someone who had been watching long enough to see accurately. He nodded once, the way a man nods when the argument he has been making against himself has finally been answered by someone who was not interested in his losing it. Nora picked up her basket. She walked on toward the house. She did not look back, not because she was uncertain, but because she was not. And a woman who has finally said the true thing does not need to look back to see if it landed. It landed. Eli stood at the sawhorses with the harness leather in his hands for a long time after she turned the corner. The street went about its business. The morning continued. He looked north the way he had been looking north all week, and this time the distance between here and there felt different. Not the abstract span of a man contemplating geography, but the concrete crossable distance between where he was standing and where he needed to go. The next morning he went to the Whitmore store at 9 o'clock. He wore the good shirt, the dark one he kept for church and occasions of consequence. His hair was combed. He had been up at 4 as always had done. The morning stable had stood at the wash basin longer than usual, with the specific attention of a man preparing for something that mattered. He walked north on Main Street with the deliberate step of a man who has finished deliberating. Arthur was behind the counter when he came through the door. He looked at Eli, the shirt, the hair, the expression of a man who has resolved something internally and arrived to resolve it externally. Arthur said nothing. He simply turned toward the back. Nora, Eli Callum is here. Footsteps from the storeroom, the particular sound of them. She came through the door and stopped. The look she gave him was the clearest thing he had ever seen on a human face. Not surprise, not uncertainty, not the careful, composed warmth she deployed for the general public. Just, you're here. The held breath of years finally released in 2 words that weren't even spoken. I would like to come calling on you properly, he said. Starting today, if your father is willing and if you'll have me. Arthur had found something on the shelf behind him that required his full concentration. You have it, he said to the shelf. Nora looked at Eli with the particular attention of a woman who has waited for a specific man to find his footing and is watching him find it. Something in her had settled visibly in the set of her shoulders, the quiet assurance of a person who has been patient so long that the reward when it arrives feels less like surprise than like recognition. "You know," she said, "most men who come calling bring something." He looked at his empty hands. He had thought of flowers. He had not, in the careful preparation of the morning, thought of flowers quite as far as the actual acquiring of them. "I'll bring them tomorrow." "Is there going to be a tomorrow?" The words came out of him with the certainty of a man who has stopped hedging what he is certain of. "Every day, for as long as you'll have me." She looked at him one moment longer. Then she smiled, the real one, the one that was not available to the room. The one that had always been waiting for him to understand it was his. "Then you'd better not be late," she said. Arthur, behind the counter, continued to find the shelf extremely interesting. Eli walked back down Main Street with the particular lightness of a man who has put down something he did not realize he had been carrying. The stable was where he had left it. The horses were where he had left them. The morning was exactly what it had been 2 hours ago. Nothing in Crestfall had changed except the one thing that had always needed changing, and the one thing, as it turned out, had been the whole of it. He stopped at Calhoun's smithy on the way back. Calhoun looked up from the anvil, took one look at him, set the hammer down. He studied Eli's face with the careful attention of a man reading terrain. "Well," Calhoun said. "Well," Eli said. Calhoun picked his hammer back up. He turned back to the anvil. But there was something in the way his shoulders settled, a loosening, a quiet satisfaction that a man of Calhoun's particular temperament would never announce directly, that said everything it needed to say without a single additional word. Eli went back to the stable. He brought wildflowers the next morning, not bought ones, because the bought ones at the general store felt circular in a way that struck him as missing the point. He found them along the creek bank south of town in the early morning, before Crestfall woke, the kind that grew without anyone planning them, simple and honest and exactly themselves. Nora put them in a glass jar on the store counter without explanation. The town noticed. The town always noticed. The speculation that followed was considerable and wrong in its specifics, but accurate in its general direction. And Nora let it run without comment because the jar of flowers said what it said, and she saw no reason to say it differently. What the town was watching, though it would take them some time to fully understand what they were watching, was not a courtship beginning. It was a courtship resuming, picking up from a place it had been running all along. Underground, unmapped, carrying the patience of two people who had been circling the same thing from different distances for years. One of them knowing it, one of them not yet equipped to know it. Both of them finally standing in the same place at the same time, facing the same direction. Courtship in a frontier town is not a private matter. It never was. The people of Crestfall had watched Nora Whitmore decline every eligible man in the county for 6 years, with the patient attention of an audience waiting for a story to find its proper ending. And when the jar of wildflowers appeared on the Whitmore counter, without explanation, the audience understood that the ending had begun. They watched with the invested interest of people who felt, with some justification, that they had earned a stake in the outcome. Eli did not notice most of this. He was not a man who tracked the social weather of a town the way some men did, reading the temperature of every conversation for information about himself. He noticed what was in front of him, which was Nora, the specific daily accumulating reality of her available. Now in a way it had never been available before, not because she had changed, but because he had finally stopped standing at a distance he had invented. He came to Tuesday's supper at the Whitmore house the second week of August. Margaret had set the table with the good china that Eli recognized from the 2 church Christmases he had attended as a younger man, when the Whitmore family had hosted the parish meal. The candles were real wax, not tallow. Margaret moved between the kitchen and the table with the efficiency of a woman who has been planning this particular meal since long before it was scheduled, and if she was pleased in a way that exceeded the ordinary pleasures of hospitality, she managed it with the practiced composure of a woman who understood that excess sentiment at a table could make a man feel cornered. Arthur carved the roast with the focused attention he gave everything that required a sharp instrument in a steady hand. He talked about the supply situation from Cheyenne, about a road dispute 2 counties west that had been in the territorial paper, about the Henderson spread's new fencing. He talked to Eli with the easy, practical directness he used with men he respected, and if there was something warmer underneath it than the ordinary warmth of a host, it arrived as a quality of attention rather than a declaration. Nora sat across from Eli. They talked the way they had always talked, The dry humor intact, the easy shorthand of people who had been in each other's peripheral lives long enough to have built a private vocabulary of reference. The difference was that neither of them was working to keep it ordinary. The labor of pretending that this was simply neighborly, the careful maintenance of a distance that had never been honest. That labor was gone, and its absence made the conversation lighter, in a way that both of them felt without naming. After supper, Arthur found something in the barn that needed checking, a thing that had apparently not needed checking before the meal. Margaret found something in the kitchen. Eli stood on the back porch with Nora in the cooling evening, the sky going dark over the eastern ridge, and they talked about nothing significant for 20 minutes in the way that people talk when the significant thing is simply being where they are together without the old distance sitting between them like a third party that nobody invited. He brought flowers every time he came. Not always wildflowers. Some days it was something he had noticed on the road north, a sprig of late summer sage, once a single stem of something purple he couldn't name that grew near the creek where the Henderson property line ran. Nora never asked what they were. She put them in the jar. The jar moved to different positions on the counter as the weeks passed, settling finally near the window, where the morning light hit it, and nobody in Crestfall who came through that door failed to notice it, because nobody in Crestfall failed to notice anything that had the word Eli Callum attached to it by now. The Sunday in the third week of August, they rode to the ridge above the valley. Eli had 2 horses ready at the stable, the steady roan he kept for clients who needed reliable over fast, the smaller bay that Nora had ridden before on the 2 occasions over the years when the Whitmore family had borrowed horses for a church picnic. The ride up took 40 minutes along the switchback trail that came out above the tree line, onto the open bench where the whole of Crestfall County spread below the town, a collection of small rectangles at the valley floor. The ranches scattered outward in the patterns of water access and land. Contour the mountains behind everything enormous and indifferent, in the way that only very old things can afford to be. They sat in the late afternoon light on a flat granite shelf that generations of riders had used for the same purpose, looking down at the life below from the height that made it legible. The grass had gone gold in the August heat. The sky was the particular clean blue that Wyoming produced in late summer, the kind of blue that made eastern visitors stop their wagons to look up. Nora asked the question that had been running underneath the weeks of flowers and suppers, the question that deserved a real answer. Why me, Eli? There were other prospects, better prospects by some measures. He didn't answer quickly. He was not a man who answered questions before the answer was ready. He looked at the valley below, at the geometry of roads and fence lines that marked off the human portion of the landscape from the wilderness that surrounded it. Then, because you never required me to be anything other than what I am. His voice was level without ornamentation. Every man who came through your father's door had something to show you. Land, money, standing. A future with a specific set of numbers attached. He turned to look at her directly. I showed up twice a week for 7 years with nails and rope and lamp oil. I was just a man doing his work the same every time. You saw that. You kept seeing it. That's not a small thing, Nora. That's a rarer thing than people who have it understand. She was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the bench with the smell of the high grass, warm with the stored heat of the day. Franklin Holt is a good man, she said. Not as a challenge, as a fact she wanted acknowledged. He is. No hesitation in it. A serious man. The kind of man a woman could build a secure life with and not have to apologize to anyone for choosing. She turned to look at him with the directness that was one of her fundamental qualities, the gaze of a woman who had never found it useful to look at things sideways. I waited for you, not because I had no other choice, because you were the choice, the only one that was ever really on the table for me, no matter how many other men put themselves on it. A pause waited with the honesty of a person saying exactly what they mean. Don't make me explain that twice. He looked at her, this woman who had held something quietly for years, who had kept it without performing it, who had offered it to him finally on a dusty street, without conditions or accusation, who had never once made him feel the cost of his own slowness, even though she had every right to. He felt the specific gratitude of a man who understands fully what almost didn't happen. Not the comfortable gratitude of someone who received a gift they expected, but the sharp-edged kind that comes from knowing how close the other version of the story came to being the real one. I know what it cost you to wait, he said. I know that I'm the reason it cost anything. I don't intend to be careless with that again. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back at the valley, the gold light on the grass, the town below, going about its late afternoon business. The smoke from the smithy, the movement of wagons, the ordinary life of a place that continued indifferently, whether important things happened in it or not. She was smiling in the way of a woman who has arrived somewhere she intended to arrive, and the arrival is exactly what she thought it would be. Franklin Holt found Eli on a Monday morning in the third week of September, 9 days into the acknowledged courtship. He came down the south end of Main Street with the unhurried purposefulness that was his natural mode of movement, and he stopped at the livery door where Eli was inspecting a wheel repair on a client's wagon. He was not accompanied by anyone. He had the look of a man who has decided on a conversation he does not particularly want to have, but considers necessary. Eli straightened from the wheel. He looked at Holt without wariness. He was not a man who met things with wariness when straightforwardness would serve. Holt stood with his hat in his hand, which was a gesture of respect that a man of Holt's position did not make casually. "I know you're calling on Nora Whitmore," he said. "Flat factual, no edge in it." "I am. Equally flat, equally without edge." Holt looked at him for a moment with the evaluating attention that was his characteristic register reading something taking a measurement. "I was going to make a formal offer," he said. "I want you to know that. I don't think it serves either of us to pretend otherwise." Eli said nothing. He waited. With Holt, the correct response was to let the man finish because Holt was not a man who said things for the pleasure of hearing himself speak. "I saw her look at you at the dance." Holt's voice was even carrying no self-pity, just the quality of a man reporting an observation he had made and acted on. "I'm a man who pays attention. I've built everything I have by paying attention to what's actually in front of me, rather than what I prefer to see." He turned his hat once in his hands. What was in front of me across a barn in July was a woman looking at a man who was looking somewhere else. I know what that means. I've known what it meant since that night. Eli held the other man's gaze. He understood that this was not a concession made easily. A man who had built what Holt built from nothing did not make easy concessions about anything. "I want a wife who chooses me," Holt said. And the words had the quality of a principle he had held for a long time tested against this specific circumstance found to apply. "Not a woman who settles for me because the man she was waiting for didn't have the sense to arrive on time." He put his hat back on. He extended his hand. "You arrived," he said. "Later than you should have. But you arrived." Eli took the hand. The handshake was firm on both sides, the kind that meant something beyond the transaction of greeting. Holt turned and walked back up the street, steady, unhurried, the same man leaving as had arrived, undiminished by what he had just done. He passed the Whitmore store without stopping. Eli watched him go. He thought about what it takes for a man to look at the thing he wants and say with clear eyes and without bitterness, "This one is not mine." He thought about the specific cost of that kind of honesty, which is higher than most people's honesty because it requires accurate accounting rather than convenient accounting. He had a new and uncomplicated respect for Franklin Holt that had nothing to do with his cattle operation or his credit at the Laramie Bank. He also understood, standing there watching Holt's back go up the street, what the handshake had really transferred. Not Nora. Nora had never been anyone's to transfer. What it had transferred was the last argument Eli had been making to himself, the residual doubt that had lived in the corner of his chest since the Monday in the stable when Calhoun said within the month. The doubt that said, maybe you're wrong about this. Maybe you've misread it. Maybe the man you're stepping past is the better man for her. Holt had just told him with the precision of a careful observer that he had not misread it, that Nora had not misread it, that the only variable in the story had ever been whether Eli would find his way to the same page everyone else had already been reading. He went back to the wheel. He finished the repair. He did the afternoon work. He went to supper at the Whitmore house on Tuesday. He brought flowers on Wednesday. He rode to the Ridge on Sunday. The courtship moved through September with the unhurried certainty of a thing that has found its proper pace, not rushed because neither of them needed to rush, not slow because neither of them had any remaining interest in waiting. They were simply two people who had arrived at the same place from different distances, spending the season learning what it looked like to be there together. October came without asking. In Wyoming, it always does. The cold came down from the high peaks in the first week, the grass curing fast to brown, the mornings requiring a coat before 7. The mountains showed their first snow on the north faces by mid-month, the high white line that meant the season was settling into what it intended to be. The harvest social was held on the second Saturday of October in the same barn behind Keener's feed store, where the midsummer dance had taken place 3 months before. The barn had been cleared again, the hay moved back, the lanterns hung. Half the county came. Eli arrived with Nora, not coincidentally this time, not from different directions, and the arrival of the two of them together through the barn doors produced a social effect in Crestfall's assembled community that several people would describe later as the satisfying conclusion of a very long book. They danced. Eli was not a natural dancer. He was competent in the way of a man who has learned a skill because occasions require it, careful with the timing, attentive to his partner. Nora made up for whatever he lacked in instinct with the ease of a woman who had been dancing at these events since she was 15. And the combination worked the way combinations often work between people who trust each other's competence in the areas where they themselves are limited. Calhoun, who had arrived with his cousin and was not technically there to observe anyone in particular, observed everything. He did it from the far wall with a cup of something and an expression of moderate indifference that did not fool anyone who knew him. After the social walking back up Main Street in the cold October air, the other couples and families dispersing toward their homes, Eli stopped at the steps of the Whitmore store. Nora stopped with him. The street was nearly empty. The lanterns inside the store dark, the night clear overhead, with the kind of cold sky stars that appear after the summer haze burns off. He put his hand in the inside pocket of his coat. He had carried the ring for 11 days. It had belonged to his grandmother, a woman he barely remembered. She had died when he was 4, but whose ring had come to him through his uncle, with the note that it was to go to the woman Eli chose when he chose. Simple gold worn smooth on the inside from decades of a life lived while wearing it, and that smoothness seemed more honest to him than anything new would have been. He took it out. He looked at it once in the cold light. Then he looked at Nora with the same direct, unhedged gaze he had used on the morning he came to ask permission, the gaze of a man who has finished all internal argument. Nora, her name nothing before it. I need to say this plainly because I have been unclear for long enough, and you have been patient long enough, and you deserve better than a man who makes you wait for the obvious. He held the ring in his palm, not yet offering it, not yet to that word. I love you. I am clear on that the way I am clear on the things I am most certain of. The weight of the work, the feel of the weather, the shape of these mountains in every light. He paused. The cold moved through the street. I want you to be my wife. If you're willing to take on a man who was slow to understand what was standing in front of him and who has no intention of being slow about anything that matters from this point forward. Nora looked at him. The stars were very bright. Somewhere down the street, a horse shifted in a pen, the sound small and ordinary against the silence. She tilted her head slightly with the expression of a woman who has something she needs to say before she says the other thing. Eli Callum, you are without question the least romantic man in Wyoming. His mouth moved at the corner. I know it. That proposal was approximately half as poetic as the occasion called for. That is a fair assessment. She looked at him for one more moment, the cold air between them, the ring in his worn hand, the mountains behind the town standing their patient witness. Then she reached out and took the ring from his palm with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a woman taking hold of something she has already decided belongs to her. Yes, she said, simple without adornment. The word that had been waiting inside her for years finally released. Yes, finally. He put the ring on her finger on the steps of her father's store in the October dark, and she looked at it in the way you look at something you recognize, not because it's new, but because it is finally, completely, correctly yours. He held her hand for a moment in both of his, the worn palms around her fingers, and neither of them said anything further because nothing further was required. They were married on the 14th of November before the first hard snow came down from the Laramie Range. The church on Crestfall's single block of civic buildings was full in the way that churches in small towns fill for events that the community understands to be its own, not mere witness, but participant, the gathered weight of people who had watched something build and were present for its completion. Calhoun sat in the third pew on the left side. He was wearing his good coat, which he wore 3 times a year at most, and he was looking at the front of the church with the expression of a man in the grip of a feeling he would strenuously deny having if anyone asked him about it directly. Margaret Whitmore sat in the front pew with the still attentive composure of a woman watching her daughter receive something she had been hoping for longer than her daughter had been hoping for it herself. Arthur sat beside Margaret. He looked at the front of the church with the expression of a man settling an account he had been tracking for years. Nora wore her mother's wedding dress taken in at the waist, the lace at the collar freshened with new thread where the old had gone thin. She walked down the aisle with the unhurried certainty of a woman who knows exactly where she is going, and when she reached the front of the church and stood beside Eli, she looked at him with the specific, unguarded directness of a person who is done waiting for anything. Eli stood at the altar and watched her come. He thought with the clarity that arrives in moments of irreversible consequence about every Wednesday morning for 7 years, about nails and rope and lamp oil, about the rain on the windows of the dark store, and the breath gathered and put back, about Calhoun's hammer in the November morning, about Arthur's driving reins, about the month he almost let become the month that ended everything. He thought about all the versions of the story that could have been the real story, and he felt with a precision that left no room for comfortable vagueness, the full weight of what almost didn't happen. He was not going to spend one day of what came next, taking the weight of it for granted. They said their vows without elaboration. They meant every word of them in the way that people mean words when the words are not performance, but declaration, the difference between announcing a thing and becoming it. When the minister finished, the sound from the pews was not polite church applause, but the sound of 200 people releasing 3 months of held breath. What followed the ceremony was years of life built, the way good things are built, not from grand moments strung together, but from the ordinary days accumulated until they become something that holds its own weight. The livery grew, not dramatically, not from any single decision, but from the steady increment of a business run well by a man who showed up the same every day and charged honest prices and remembered what every horse needed. By the second year, Eli had hired a young man named Decker from outside of Rollins, who had been recommended by Henderson, and the stable ran 16 horses regularly where it had run 12. Nora kept the accounts. Within the first month of marriage, she had reviewed the ledger with the thoroughness of a woman who had grown up understanding that numbers were not neutral. They carried information about habits and assumptions that the person who kept them sometimes couldn't see from the inside. She found without surprise that Eli had been undercharging for specialized farrier work by a consistent margin on the apparent theory that his time was worth less than comparable work elsewhere. She corrected this with the brisk, unapologetic efficiency of a person adjusting something that was simply wrong. Eli did not argue. He had learned quickly that on matters of numbers and the value of his own work, Nora saw more clearly than he did, and that arguing with someone who sees more clearly than you is a waste of both people's time. Their son arrived in the second year of marriage. They named him Thomas for Eli's grandfather, a name that had weight in the family without having been used in a generation, which made it feel like reclaiming something rather than borrowing it. Thomas had Nora's eyes, the green-gray ones that couldn't settle on a color, in a face that had Eli's patient, considered quality, a child who watched everything before he moved, who took his time about decisions with a deliberateness that Margaret said was his father exactly. Their daughter came in the fourth year, Eliza. She arrived with the specific energy of a child who had decided before birth that the world was interesting, and she intended to investigate it thoroughly. She was quick, funny, in the particular dry way that Nora had always been opinionated about everything, from the arrangement of the kitchen to the fairness of bedtimes. She made the house louder. She made it considerably more alive. Thomas and Eliza were, by the time Eliza was old enough to participate in conflict, reliably at odds about at least one thing per day. The disputes were passionate, brief, conducted with the conviction of children who believed every small injustice to be a matter of permanent record. Eli listened to these from whatever room he was in and felt at the sound of them a specific warmth that he understood to be one of the forms of happiness he had not known to want before he had it. On a Tuesday evening in the autumn of Eliza's 14th year, she came to the kitchen where Nora was making the apple pie that had become the family's institutional response to anything worth celebrating or mourning. Eliza sat at the kitchen table with the unself-conscious ease of a girl at home in her own house and watched her mother work, and the question arrived sideways in the middle of rolling out the crust. "How did you know Papa was the right one before he knew?" Nora worked the dough for a moment. She had been waiting for this question in the specific way that mothers wait for questions they know are coming. Not dreading it, just aware of it, turning it over occasionally in quiet moments, considering how to answer it honestly without making it into a lesson that a 14-year-old would recognize as a lesson and therefore discount. "He never performed anything," she said finally. "Every man who came along was showing me something. Your father just showed up the same every time." She pressed the crust into the pan with both hands. A person who is the same whether anyone is watching is a rare thing. I knew that. Even when I was 20 and didn't have the language for it, I knew that. Eliza was quiet in this way of a girl actually thinking rather than simply waiting for the answer to finish. But you almost didn't wait because of Mr. Holt. Nora looked at her daughter Eli's patience in a face made for quicker things. Almost, she said. Honestly, without softening it. I got close to the end of my waiting. And when I got there, I said the true thing out loud to your father's face on a public street. And then I walked away. Weren't you afraid he wouldn't come? Nora slid the pie toward the oven. She considered the question with the care it deserved. Yes, she said. Terrified because saying the true thing to someone doesn't guarantee they'll say it back. All it guarantees is that you've been honest, which means whatever happens next is real. She looked at her daughter directly. That's the part I want you to keep. Not the happy ending. Any story can have one of those if you tell it right. The part worth keeping is the almost. Eliza turned this over. What do you mean the almost? I mean know what you want. Don't perform for anyone. If the person you care about is slow, give them time, but not forever. At some point, you say the true thing. Nora sat down across from her daughter. You give them the chance to show up, because some people need to be given the chance. They're not cruel, they're not indifferent. They just need someone to say this is real and it is happening and you have to decide. She paused. Your father needed that. Most people need something like it. Eliza looked at her mother with the particular focused attention of a young person receiving something they will carry for the rest of their life, not knowing yet how far they will carry it. What if they don't show up? Nora was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove made its sounds. Outside, the October wind came off the mountains with the smell of the first cold. Then you know, she said, and you move forward, because a life spent waiting for someone who won't come is not a life, it's just waiting. She covered her daughter's hands with her own on the table. But Eliza, she waited until her daughter was looking at her fully. In my experience, when you say the true thing to the right person, when you say it plainly without conditions, and then walk away and let them be who they are, they show up. She squeezed her daughter's hands once. Then she got up to check the pie. The following Sunday, without asking why, Eliza dressed in her good coat and walked into town in the direction of the Keener family's property on the north edge of Crestfall, where a boy named James Keener had been building fence on his father's land every weekend for 2 months, and who had twice in the past week found reasons to walk past the Callum house at an hour that had nothing to do with fence building. Nora watched her go from the kitchen window. She didn't call after her. She turned back to the pot on the stove. That evening, Eli came home from the stable and stopped at the gate. It had become, without his deciding to make it one, a moment he kept for himself, before entering the rest of the evening, the brief pause at the boundary of the world his work occupied and the world that waited inside the fence. Nora was in the yard with the laundry humming the formless, easy tune she always hummed at the repetitive work. The October light was thinner than summer's slanted and clear, the kind that shows things plainly rather than warmly. And in it, Nora moved with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her own life, the basket on her hip, the sheets going up on the line with practiced efficiency, her attention moving between the task and some private thought in the way of a person whose interior life has enough room in it for both. Eli stood at the gate. He looked at her the way he had learned to look at things he valued, with the full, unhurried attention of a man who has stopped taking the presence of something for granted. She noticed him. She turned. Eliza's back, she said. She's got something in her face. I saw. He came through the gate. You talked to her. We talked. She handed him the empty basket, the easy transfer of two people who have learned each other's hands over years of ordinary mornings. I told her what she needed to know. He set the basket down. He stood in front of her in the cooling yard, close enough that no distance remained between them. What did you tell her? She looked up at him. The last of the afternoon caught her eyes gray today, the way they went in autumn light. I told her that some men need time to find their way to the thing that has been waiting for them. That this is not a flaw. Her voice was quiet, without reproach, the tone of a woman who settled a question years ago and has never needed to reopen it. I told her that the cost of that waiting is real, but so is the reward when the man finally arrives. Eli held her gaze. He thought about all the mornings that had built themselves into this one, the ledger that balanced the story he had written alone, that nobody had asked for the crack that Calhoun put in it, with plain words in an empty stable. He thought about the morning he had walked north on Main Street in his good shirt, with nothing in his hands and everything he intended to offer. He put his hands on either side of her face, his worn palms against her cheeks, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded attention of a man who has never once since the day he understood what he was looking at failed to look. "I'm here," he said, not as a declaration, as a simple fact, the most ordinary words in the world, meaning everything they had ever meant, and everything they would go on meaning for all the years still ahead of them. She put her hands over his. She didn't ask what he meant. She had always known. She had been waiting with the extraordinary patience of a woman who understood that some men need time to learn the language of their own hearts for him to say it out loud. Outside, the Wyoming night was settling over Crestfall. The mountains stood where they had always stood, at the edge of everything, unchanged by the small human accountings assembled in their shadow. Somewhere in the direction of the Keener property, a girl with her mother's eyes was learning something about the courage it takes to say a true thing to the right person and then walk away. Somewhere in the third pew of the church on Sunday mornings, Calhoun sat with his good coat and his carefully maintained expression of moderate indifference which fooled nobody and which he had no intention of abandoning. Some things, if you wait too long, stop being available. Eli Callum had not waited too long. He had arrived at the last possible moment and still in time. He had walked toward the mountains he had spent years only looking at, and they had been exactly what they appeared to be from a distance, solid, real, worth every step of the crossing. That was the part worth holding. For anyone who has ever stood at a distance from something extraordinary and told themselves a careful story about why they couldn't cross it, that was the whole of it.